There is a river in the ancient world that flows the wrong way. Every river the Egyptians had ever known, every waterway they had ever navigated, every current they had ever set their sails against, flowed from south to north. The Nile, the great artery of their civilization, the only river that mattered, the only river that the gods had created, ran northward from the cataracts to the delta, from Upper Egypt to Lower Egypt, from the distant mountains of Africa to the shores of the Mediterranean. This was not merely a geographical fact, it was a theological certainty, woven into the Egyptian understanding of the cosmos, embedded in the language of their rituals, reflected in the orientation of their temples and tombs. South was upstream, north was downstream, water flowed in one direction, the world made sense. And then, sometime around 1504 BC, according to current scholarly estimates, a pharaoh named Thutmose led his army across the Sinai, through the coastal cities of the Levant, past the cedar forests of Lebanon, beyond the cities of Syria, and arrived at a river that no Egyptian army had ever seen before, the Euphrates, the great river of Mesopotamia, the waterway that sustained the kingdoms of Babylon and Assyria and Mitanni. And this river, this impossible, disorienting, world-upending river, flowed from north to south. It flowed, in the Egyptian phrase that would be used for centuries afterward, in the wrong direction. It flowed upside down. It was, to the Egyptian mind, a river that defied the order of creation, a river that announced, more clearly than any foreign city or foreign army, that the world was far larger, far stranger, and far more ungovernable than the Egyptians had ever imagined. The pharaoh who stood on the banks of that inverted river was not a man who had been born to be king. He was not the son of a pharaoh. He was not the product of a royal lineage stretching back through generations of divine blood. He was, by the best evidence available, a military commander, a general who had risen through the ranks of the Egyptian army and who had married into the royal family, probably wedding a sister or daughter of his predecessor Amenhotep I. His claim to the throne rested not on blood but on ability, not on the ancient theology of divine succession but on the harder, newer, post-Hyksos reality that the king who deserved the crown was the king who could fight for it, and fight he did. In a reign that lasted perhaps 12 to 15 years, the chronology is debated and uncertain. Thutmose I campaigned further from Egypt than any pharaoh before him. He pushed the southern frontier of Egypt deep into the Sudan, past the fourth cataract of the Nile, into territories that the Egyptians had never before attempted to control. He marched north through the Levant, subduing city-states and extracting tribute from kings who had never seen an Egyptian army. And he reached the Euphrates, the river that flowed the wrong way, where he erected a boundary stela declaring Egyptian sovereignty over lands that lay more than 1,000 kilometers from the Nile Valley. No Egyptian king had ever projected power so far. The boundary stela at the Euphrates was, in a sense, the Egyptian equivalent of planting a flag on the moon, a gesture that announced to the world that a civilization that had previously been defined by the limits of its own river valley had suddenly, dramatically, broken free of those limits and had established its presence at the farthest edge of the known world. The stela that Thutmose erected would become, for subsequent generations, a benchmark of pharaonic achievement, the standard against which all future military campaigns would be measured. When his grandson, Thutmose III, marched to the Euphrates nearly 50 years later, he sought out and renewed his grandfather's stela, erecting his own boundary marker alongside the original in a gesture of dynastic continuity that acknowledged the original achievement while claiming to have surpassed it. The renewal of the stela was itself a political act, a declaration by Thutmose III that the commitment his grandfather had made was permanent, that the Egyptian frontier at the Euphrates was not a temporary achievement of a single reign, but an enduring feature of the Egyptian state. The stela became, in effect, a sacred site, a marker not just of territory but of pharaonic ambition, a declaration inscribed in stone that the sons of Ra would never again accept the limits that geography had imposed on their ancestors. No Egyptian army had ever marched so far from home. The world that Thutmose revealed to Egypt was a world that the Middle Kingdom pharaohs could not have imagined, and that the Old Kingdom builders of pyramids would not have recognized. The encounter with the Euphrates was not a footnote in Thutmose's reign. It was the defining moment, the moment when Egypt stopped being a civilization that lived within its own borders and became a civilization that shaped the world beyond them. The boundary stela that Thutmose erected on the banks of the Euphrates was not merely a monument to a military campaign. It was a declaration of intent, an announcement that the pharaoh's authority did not end at the cataracts or the delta coast, but extended in principle to the farthest reaches of the known world. The stela was also a promise to the gods, to the Egyptian people, and to the foreign rulers who would hear of it, that Egypt would never again be the insular, inward-looking kingdom that the Hyksos had conquered. The pharaoh who stood on the banks of the Euphrates was not the same kind of pharaoh who had built the pyramids, or who had composed the literary masterworks of the Middle Kingdom. He was something entirely and radically new, a warrior emperor whose battlefield extended from Africa to Asia, and whose ambitions encompassed the entire world that his civilization knew. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand how a man of no royal blood became the architect of the greatest territorial expansion in Egyptian history. You are going to understand the military campaigns that took Egypt from a Nile Valley kingdom to a Near Eastern empire, campaigns that stretched from the fourth cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, encompassing a territory of more than 2,000 kilometers from south to north. You are going to understand the innovations in military strategy, royal ideology, and imperial administration that Thutmose introduced, and that his successors, including his grandson, the legendary Thutmose III, would refine into the most sophisticated imperial system of the Bronze Age. You are going to understand the Valley of the Kings, the hidden necropolis that Thutmose may have been the first pharaoh to use, abandoning the millennium-old pyramid tradition in favor of concealed rock-cut tombs that reflected the practical lessons of a world in which nothing, not even the pharaoh's eternal rest, could be taken for granted. And you are going to understand the personal cost of empire, the strain on a single human life of carrying the weight of a civilization's ambitions to the edges of the known world and beyond. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let's begin. The Egypt that Thutmose I inherited was an Egypt transformed. The Hyksos had been expelled barely 2 generations earlier. Ahmose I, the boy king who had driven the foreign rulers from the delta and reunified the two lands, had died around 1525 BC, leaving behind a kingdom that was still in the early stages of its post-liberation reconstruction. The scars of the Hyksos period were still fresh, not just in the physical landscape, where the fortifications and the damage of war were still visible, but in the psychological landscape of a civilization that had been shaken to its foundations by the experience of foreign domination. The Egyptians had learned, through the trauma of the Hyksos conquest, that their civilization was not invulnerable, that the desert barriers and the cataracts that had protected the Nile Valley for 15 centuries were not impregnable, and this knowledge had generated a new kind of national consciousness, a new kind of anxiety, a new kind of vigilance, and a new kind of ambition that was fundamentally different from anything that had characterized the Old or Middle Kingdoms. Ahmose's son, Amenhotep I, had continued the work of consolidation, strengthening the administration, rebuilding temples, and conducting military operations in Nubia to secure the southern frontier. Amenhotep's reign, which lasted approximately 20 to 25 years, was a period of stabilization rather than expansion, a time for repairing the damage of the Hyksos period, establishing the institutional foundations of the new kingdom state, and building the military capacity that would be needed for the imperial campaigns that were to come. Amenhotep was a capable and popular ruler. His cult persisted for centuries after his death, and the workers of the royal tombs at Deir el-Medina celebrated his festival with a devotion that suggests genuine affection rather than mere ritual obligation. His reign saw the establishment of several institutions that would become central to the new kingdom state, including possibly the founding of the community of royal tomb workers at Deir el-Medina itself, the village of specialized craftsmen artists, and labourers, whose task it was to construct and decorate the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. If this attribution is correct, it means that Amenhotep was already planning for the new style of royal burial, the hidden, rock-cut tomb rather than the visible pyramid that would characterize the new kingdom. But Amenhotep was a capable ruler. He was later deified, together with his mother Ahmose I, as a patron saint of the Theban necropolis. But he was not a conqueror, he was a builder, a consolidator, a man who prepared the ground for the harvest that his successor would reap. The world that Amenhotep bequeathed to his successor was a world of both extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary danger. The Egyptian army was strong, stronger than it had been at any point in the country's history. The treasury was full, replenished by the Nubian gold mines and the agricultural surplus of a reunified kingdom. The administrative apparatus was functioning, staffed by officials who had been trained in the post-Hyksos bureaucratic system and who understood the requirements of centralized governance. But the strategic environment was unstable. The kingdom of Mitanni was consolidating its power in northern Syria and was beginning to project influence into the Levantine city-states that Egypt regarded as its own sphere of interest. The Nubian kingdom of Kerma, though weakened by the Egyptian campaigns of the early 18th Dynasty, remained a potential threat on the southern frontier. The Levantine city-states themselves were unreliable, willing to accept Egyptian overlordship when the Egyptian army was present, but quick to rebel or switch allegiance when the army withdrew. The new pharaoh would inherit a kingdom that was militarily strong but strategically exposed, a kingdom that needed, above all, a leader who could project power decisively and who could establish, through a combination of military force and diplomatic skill, the permanent Egyptian presence in the Levant and Nubia that was necessary to secure the country's borders. The transition from Amenhotep I to Thutmose I is one of the most significant and most obscure moments in the history of the new kingdom. Amenhotep appears to have died without a male heir, creating a succession crisis that was resolved by the accession of a man who was, by all indications, not of royal blood. The evidence for Thutmose's non-royal origins is circumstantial but compelling. His mother, Sensneb, bore no royal titles, a significant absence in a culture where the lineage of the king's mother was meticulously recorded and elaborately honoured. His father is never named in any surviving inscription, an omission that is extraordinarily unusual in a culture that recorded genealogies with obsessive care, and that regarded the identity of both parents as essential information for any individual of consequence. Another significant absence that suggests either that Thutmose's paternal lineage was not considered impressive enough to advertise, or that it was actively concealed. The silence about his parentage stands in stark contrast to the elaborate genealogical claims that other pharaohs made. The detailed records of royal ancestry, the careful documentation of the mother's royal lineage, the theological fiction of divine paternity, that was the standard framework for royal legitimacy. Thutmose's inscriptions simply do not discuss the subject. They focus instead on his achievements, his military campaigns, his building projects, his devotion to the gods, as though the accomplishments of his reign were sufficient justification for his presence on the throne, without the need for genealogical credentials. This focus on achievement over ancestry is itself significant. It suggests a pharaoh who defined his legitimacy in terms of what he did rather than who he was, a ruler whose claim to the throne rested on performance rather than pedigree. The historian must pause here and acknowledge the significance of this shift. For more than 15 centuries, from the founding of the Egyptian state under the first pharaohs of the early dynastic period through the Old Kingdom, the first intermediate period, the Middle Kingdom, the second intermediate period, and the wars of liberation, the pharaoh had been, in theory, if not always in practice, a figure defined by his blood. The pharaoh was divine because his parents were divine. His authority came from his nature, not from his achievements. The revolution that the new kingdom represented, the acceptance that the throne could go to a man whose qualifications were military rather than genetic, was a profound transformation of the Egyptian understanding of kingship. It was not announced, it was not celebrated, It was not even explicitly acknowledged in the inscriptions. But it happened, and it happened because the Hyksos had demonstrated, more clearly than any theological argument ever could, that a king defined by his bloodline was useless if he could not fight. The most likely explanation is that Thutmose I was a military officer, possibly a general, who had distinguished himself in the campaigns of Amenhotep's reign and who had secured his claim to the throne through marriage to a royal woman, probably a princess named Ahmose, who carried the legitimacy of the royal bloodline. This method of succession, the elevation of a capable military commander to the throne through marriage into the royal family, would have been unthinkable in the Old Kingdom, when the pharaoh's divinity was understood to be an inherent quality transmitted through royal blood. It would have been deeply problematic in the Middle Kingdom, when the usurper Amenhotep I had spent his entire reign constructing literary and institutional mechanisms to legitimize his non-royal seizure of power. But in the New Kingdom, in the post-Hyksos world that valued military competence above all other royal qualities, the accession of a proven soldier to the throne was not merely acceptable, it was, in a sense, expected. The Hyksos experience had taught the Egyptians that a pharaoh who could not fight was a pharaoh who could not protect his people. The theological fiction of divine birth was maintained. Thutmose I, like all pharaohs, claimed to be the son of Ra, the living Horus, the embodiment of cosmic order, but the practical reality was that the throne of Egypt now belonged to the man who could best defend it, and Thutmose I was, above all things, a soldier. The exact date of Thutmose's accession is uncertain. Scholarly estimates range from approximately 1506 to 1504 BC, depending on which chronological framework is adopted. What is certain is that he wasted no time. The inscriptions that record his reign describe a pharaoh who hit the ground running, launching military campaigns within the first years of his rule that would transform the territorial extent of the Egyptian state and establish the model of imperial governance that his successors would follow for the next 4 centuries. The military machine that Thutmose inherited and that he would deploy with devastating effectiveness was the product of the post-Hyksos military revolution that had been underway since the Wars of Liberation. The Egyptian army of the early 18th Dynasty was a fundamentally different institution from the militia-based forces of the Middle Kingdom. It was a professional standing army, recruited from across Egypt, trained in the use of the chariot, the composite bow, and the bronze khopesh sword, organized into divisions named after the great gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and commanded by a professional officer corps, whose members had earned their positions through demonstrated competence in the field. The infantry, the backbone of the army, was organized into companies and battalions commanded by officers who had earned their commissions through demonstrated ability rather than hereditary privilege. The equipment of the common soldier had improved dramatically since the Middle Kingdom. Shields were larger and more effective, body armor of leather or linen was more widely available, and the weapons of war included not just the traditional Egyptian self-bow and copper-bladed spear, but the superior bronze weapons and the devastating composite bow that the Hyksos had introduced. The army marched with a logistical train, supply wagons, pack animals, portable water supplies, and the administrative staff who managed the complex business of feeding, supplying, and paying thousands of men on the march. This was not the ad hoc militia that the Old Kingdom pharaohs had raised for seasonal campaigns. This was a permanent military establishment, a professional force that trained continuously, maintained its readiness year-round, and was capable of deploying at short notice to any point on Egypt's increasingly extensive frontier. The transformation from militia to professional army was one of the most consequential institutional changes in Egyptian history, comparable in its impact to the administrative centralization of Senusret III or the literary revolution of Amenhotep I. A militia-based army fights when called upon and returns to civilian life when the campaign is over. A professional army is always ready, always trained, always available, and always expensive. The maintenance of a standing army requires a permanent commitment of resources: food, weapons, equipment, pay, housing, training facilities. That represents a continuous drain on the treasury. The decision to maintain a professional military establishment was, in effect, a decision to restructure the Egyptian economy around the requirements of national defense, to divert a significant percentage of the kingdom's agricultural surplus from civilian purposes to military purposes on a permanent basis. This was the hidden cost of the post-Hyksos military revolution, a cost that was not merely financial but social, as the requirements of military service drew thousands of men away from agricultural production and created a new social class, the professional soldier, whose interests and values were increasingly distinct from those of the civilian population. The chariot corps, the elite arm of the Egyptian military, composed of paired charioteers and archers who could deliver devastating firepower while moving at speed, was the decisive weapon of New Kingdom warfare, and it had been developed, refined, and perfected over the 2 generations since the Hyksos had first introduced chariot technology to the Nile Valley. The army also possessed something that no previous Egyptian military force had enjoyed: experience. The campaigns of Ahmose and Amenhotep I had created a corps of veteran soldiers and officers who had fought in Nubia, in the Delta, and in southern Palestine. These veterans, men like Ahmose, son of Ibana, whose autobiography records his service under 3 successive pharaohs, brought to Thutmose's campaigns not just military skill, but institutional knowledge. They knew how to move an army across the Sinai. They knew how to supply a force operating hundreds of kilometers from its home base. They knew how to conduct siege operations against fortified cities. They knew how to negotiate the treacherous politics of the Levantine city-states, where loyalties shifted with the wind, and today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy without warning. The logistics of Bronze Age warfare were, by modern standards, staggeringly difficult. Every arrow had to be handcrafted. Every bronze weapon had to be individually cast, hammered, and sharpened. Every chariot had to be assembled from materials sourced from across the ancient world: the wood for the frame, the leather for the fittings, the metal for the axle and the tire, the horses that pulled it. The supply of horses alone was a major logistical challenge. The Egyptian Delta was not natural horse breeding country, and the army's horse supply depended on a combination of domestic breeding programs, tribute from vassal states, and the capture of enemy horses in battle. The compound bow, the devastating long-range weapon that the Hyksos had introduced and that the Egyptian army had adopted, required horn, wood, and sinew laminated together with a precision that could only be achieved by specialized craftsmen whose skills were passed from master to apprentice across generations. Every component of the Egyptian military machine required a supply chain, a manufacturing process, and a corps of specialized workers whose labor was essential but whose contribution to the great victories of the pharaoh would never be recorded in any inscription. This accumulated experience, the corporate memory of 2 generations of continuous military operations, was Thutmose's most valuable asset, and he used it with a strategic intelligence that marks him as one of the great military commanders of the ancient world. Thutmose's first major campaign was directed southward, into Nubia, the land beyond the cataracts, that had been a source of wealth, anxiety, and intermittent warfare for Egyptian pharaohs since the earliest dynasties. The Nubian campaigns of the early New Kingdom were driven by the same combination of economic ambition and strategic anxiety that had motivated the Middle Kingdom fortress builders. Nubia was the source of gold, the precious metal that was the foundation of Egypt's international prestige and the currency of its diplomatic relationships with the other great powers of the Near East. Control of the Nubian gold mines was essential to the functioning of the New Kingdom state, and securing that control required the projection of military power deep into territories that were hostile, remote, and logistically challenging to reach. But Thutmose's ambitions in Nubia went far beyond anything his predecessors had attempted, where Senusret III had established the Egyptian frontier at the Second Cataract, roughly 300 kilometers south of the traditional border at Aswan. Thutmose pushed the frontier past the Third Cataract, past the Fourth Cataract, deep into the territory of the Kingdom of Kush, to a point approximately 800 kilometers south of Aswan. This was an extraordinary feat of military logistics, requiring the movement of an army through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth, across cataracts that blocked river navigation, through deserts that offered no water or shade, and against a Nubian population that was experienced in warfare, and that fought with the desperate courage of people defending their homeland. An inscription at the island of Thutmose, near the Third Cataract, records Thutmose's Nubian campaign in language that conveys both the pharaoh's military confidence and his personal involvement in the fighting. The inscription describes Thutmose personally killing a Nubian chieftain in battle and displaying the body on the prow of his ship as he sailed back to Egypt, a gesture that combined military pragmatism with political theatre. The display of the enemy's body was a standard practice in Egyptian military culture, a means of demonstrating victory to both the army and the civilian population, of demoralizing remaining enemy forces, and of establishing the pharaoh's personal credentials as a warrior king. It was designed to demonstrate to both the Nubians and the Egyptian court that the pharaoh was not a distant commander directing operations from behind the lines, but a warrior who fought and killed with his own hands. The image of the dead chieftain hanging from the royal ship, grotesque by modern standards, electrifying by ancient ones, became one of the defining images of Thutmose's reign, a symbol of the ferocious, personal courage that set him apart from the bureaucratic pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, and that established the model of the warrior king that his successors would emulate for generations. The image was carefully crafted, not merely a spontaneous act of battlefield brutality, but a calculated statement of the new pharaonic ideology. The Old Kingdom pharaoh had been depicted performing rituals, offering to the gods, smiting symbolic enemies in conventionalized poses that represented cosmic order rather than actual combat. The Middle Kingdom pharaoh had been depicted as a builder and administrator, a man whose achievements were institutional rather than martial. The New Kingdom pharaoh, as Thutmose's Thutmose inscription makes clear, was something different. A warrior whose legitimacy derived from his personal participation in violence, whose authority was demonstrated not in the temple but on the battlefield, and whose relationship with his enemies was not symbolic but lethally, viscerally, physically real. The dead chieftain hanging from the prow of the ship was not a metaphor. He was a man who had been alive that morning and who was dead now because the pharaoh of Egypt had killed him with his own royal, blood-stained mortal hands. This is the new kingship. This is the pharaoh as warrior, as killer, as the man whose divine authority is demonstrated not through rituals performed in the safety of a temple, but through violence inflicted on the bodies of the kingdom's enemies in the heat and terror of battle. This is what the Hyksos made necessary. The Nubian campaign established the southern boundary of the Egyptian empire at a point deeper into Africa than any previous Egyptian state had reached, and deeper than any subsequent Egyptian state would maintain for more than a few generations. The campaign was not without its costs. Moving an army through the cataracts of the Nile required enormous effort. Each cataract was a stretch of rapids and rocks that blocked river navigation, forcing the army to portage its boats and supplies overland around the obstruction before continuing upstream. The first cataract at Aswan was manageable. A canal had been cut through the rocks during the Middle Kingdom, though it may have needed clearing or repair. The second and third cataracts were far more difficult, stretches of white water and jagged rock that could destroy boats and scatter supplies if not navigated with extreme care. The heat was ferocious. Temperatures in Upper Nubia regularly exceeded 40 degrees Celsius during the summer months, and the desert that pressed in on both sides of the narrow river valley offered no shade and no relief. Disease was a constant companion. The stagnant waters of the Upper Nile bred mosquitoes that carried malaria, and the cramped conditions of an army on the march facilitated the spread of dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. Every kilometre south of Aswan was a kilometre further from home, a kilometre deeper into hostile territory, a kilometre that stretched the army's supply lines thinner and made the prospect of retreat more dangerous. The territory that Thutmose conquered was not merely raided and abandoned, as earlier pharaohs had raided Nubian settlements. It was occupied and administered, garrisoned by Egyptian soldiers, governed by Egyptian officials, and integrated into the administrative structure of the Egyptian state through a system of provincial governance that was overseen by a new official called the Viceroy of Kush, or the King's Son of Kush. This office, one of the most important innovations of the early New Kingdom, gave a single appointed official authority over the entire Egyptian province of Nubia, from the First Cataract to the southern frontier. The viceroy reported directly to the pharaoh, commanded military forces, collected tribute and taxes, supervised mining operations, and maintained order across a vast territory that stretched for hundreds of kilometers along the Nile. The viceroy was one of the most powerful officials in the Egyptian state, second only to the vizier in authority, and, in some respects, more independent, since the distance from the capital gave the viceroy a degree of autonomy that few other officials enjoyed. The men who held this office were typically drawn from the military or the highest ranks of the civil administration. Experienced professionals whose loyalty to the pharaoh was beyond question and whose administrative competence was sufficient to manage a province that was, in many respects, as complex and as challenging as Egypt itself. The viceroy's responsibilities included the management of the Nubian gold mines, the most economically important resource in the entire Egyptian empire, the maintenance of the frontier fortresses, the administration of justice among the Nubian population, the collection of tribute from subject peoples, and the conduct of military operations against any Nubian groups that resisted Egyptian authority. It was, in effect, a colonial governorship, the first of its kind in Egyptian history, and a model that would be refined and extended by Thutmose's successors as the empire grew. The creation of the Viceroy of Kush was a structural innovation of the first importance, the invention of a colonial administrative framework that allowed Egypt to govern a foreign territory as a permanent province rather than merely raiding it periodically for resources and slaves. The Middle Kingdom had maintained a military presence in Nubia through the fortress chain at the Second Cataract, but it had not attempted the kind of comprehensive administrative integration that Thutmose established. The Viceroy of Kush was not merely a garrison commander. He was a governor, a representative of the pharaoh who administered the province in the pharaoh's name, who collected taxes, who dispensed justice, who supervised the exploitation of natural resources, and who managed the complex relationship between the Egyptian occupation force and the indigenous Nubian population. The system was colonial in the fullest sense of the word, and it would serve as the model for Egyptian imperial administration for the next 4 centuries. The Nubian campaign also had a symbolic dimension that went beyond its military and administrative significance. By pushing the Egyptian frontier past the Fourth Cataract, Thutmose had demonstrated that the Egyptian state was capable of projecting power to distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. The Fourth Cataract lies approximately 800 kilometers south of the traditional border at Aswan, a distance that, in the context of Bronze Age transportation and logistics, was enormous. An army that could march 800 kilometers into hostile territory and sustain itself long enough to fight, conquer, and establish permanent administrative control was an army that could go virtually anywhere in the ancient world. The Nubian campaign was not just a conquest. It was a proof of concept, a demonstration that the New Kingdom military machine was capable of operating at distances and scales that previous Egyptian armies had never attempted. The Nubian campaign of Thutmose I was, in its strategic significance, the southern anchor of the New Kingdom Empire, the foundation on which the entire imperial structure rested. The gold that flowed northward from the Nubian mines financed the military campaigns in the Levant, paid the professional army that defended the empire's frontiers, funded the building programs that filled Egypt with temples and monuments, and purchased the luxury goods that sustained the diplomatic gift exchange system connecting Egypt to the other great powers of the Near East. Without Nubian gold, the New Kingdom Empire would have been unsustainable. The military machine that Thutmose had built required a continuous flow of precious metal to maintain, and the Nubian mines were the primary source of that flow. The conquest of Nubia was not a sideshow to the main event of the Euphrates campaign. It was the economic prerequisite, the essential first step in building the resource base that would make the Northern Empire possible. But the Nubian campaign, impressive as it was merely the prelude to the achievement that would define Thutmose's reign and transform the history of the ancient Near East. The campaign in the north, the march to the Euphrates, was the event that turned Egypt from a regional power into a world empire. The northern campaign of Thutmose I was not merely a military expedition. It was a civilizational statement, a declaration that Egypt was no longer content to be a Nile Valley kingdom, no longer willing to hide behind the desert barriers that had once seemed sufficient, no longer satisfied with the management of its own internal affairs. The Hyksos experience had taught Egypt that the world beyond the borders was dangerous, that peoples and powers existed out there who had the means and the motivation to conquer the sacred land. The only defense against that danger was to go out and meet it, to project Egyptian power across the Sinai, into the Levant, and beyond, creating a buffer zone of subject territories and vassal states that would absorb any future threat before it reached the Nile Valley itself. The strategic logic was sound, and it was the same logic that would drive the foreign policies of great powers for millennia afterward. The Roman Empire's frontier policy, the British Empire's forward defense doctrine, the American policy of maintaining military bases across the globe. All are expressions of the same basic principle. The best way to defend the homeland is to fight the enemy on someone else's territory. Thutmose I was, in this sense, the inventor of imperial grand strategy, the first ruler in Egyptian history, and one of the first in world history to articulate and implement the idea that national security requires the projection of military power far beyond the national borders. The campaign to the Euphrates required a logistical effort that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of Egyptian military planners. The distance from Thebes to the Euphrates is approximately 1,400 kilometers, roughly the distance from London to Rome or from New York to Miami. Moving an army across this distance in the 15th century BC, an army that included chariots, horses, infantry, supply wagons, and the entire logistical apparatus of a Bronze Age military force, was an undertaking of staggering complexity. The army had to cross the Sinai Desert, a barren wasteland of sand and rock that offered no water, no food, and no shelter from the murderous heat. It had to pass through the coastal cities of the Levant, Gaza, Ashkelon, Joppa, Byblos, cities whose rulers might be friendly or hostile depending on the political calculations of the moment. It had to secure water sources, wells and springs that were spaced unevenly along the route, and that could be poisoned, blocked, or ambushed by hostile local populations. It had to feed thousands of men and hundreds of horses in a landscape that offered only intermittent agricultural surpluses, relying on a combination of carried provisions, local procurement, and tribute extracted from the cities along the route. It had to maintain discipline and cohesion across weeks of marching through unfamiliar territory, where the physical exhaustion of the march, the psychological strain of operating far from home, and the constant threat of ambush or surprise attack could erode the morale and the fighting effectiveness of even the most experienced soldiers. And it had to navigate the complex terrain of the Lebanese mountains, where narrow passes and dense cedar forests offered opportunities for ambush. And it had to penetrate the interior of Syria, a region that was politically fragmented, culturally diverse, and strategically contested by the great powers of the Near East, including the rising kingdom of Mitanni, which controlled the upper Euphrates Valley and whose chariot armies were among the most powerful in the ancient world. Mitanni was a Hurrian state. Its population spoke Hurrian, an agglutinative language unrelated to either Egyptian or Semitic, but its ruling elite included an Indo-Aryan element whose presence is reflected in the Sanskrit-derived names of some Mitanni kings and in the horse training manual attributed to Kikuli of Mitanni, which uses Sanskrit terms for horse colours and training techniques. The Mitanni were master horsemen and chariot warriors. Their military technology was at least equal to Egypt's, and their strategic position astride the upper Euphrates gave them control over vital trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. A conflict with Mitanni was not a border skirmish. It was a confrontation between two great powers whose interests were fundamentally incompatible. Both claimed sovereignty over the same Levantine territories, and neither was willing to concede. The route that Thutmose followed northward through the Levant can be reconstructed approximately from the scattered evidence of inscriptions, archaeological remains, and the later campaigns of his successors who followed the same roads. The army would have marched from the Egyptian fortress town of Charu, the departure point for military expeditions into the Levant, located near the modern Suez Canal, across the northern Sinai, along a route that was punctuated by fortified way stations providing water and supplies. This route, known in later periods as the Ways of Horus, was a vital military highway, the lifeline of the Northern Empire, that the Egyptians had been developing and fortifying since the early 18th Dynasty, a road that connected the Nile Delta to the coastal cities of the Levant, and that would become, over the next 4 centuries, the primary artery of Egyptian imperial communication and military deployment. The maintenance of this road, its water stations, its supply depots, its garrison posts, was an essential infrastructure investment that made the entire Northern Empire possible. Our primary source for the Northern campaign is, once again, the autobiography of Ahmose, son of Ibana, the same soldier whose account of the Siege of Avaris provides the most vivid testimony of the wars of liberation. By the time of Thutmose's Euphrates campaign, Ahmose, son of Ibana, was an old man, a veteran of 3 reigns who had fought his way from common soldier to honoured elder. His account of the Northern campaign is characteristically terse and focused on his own deeds, the enemies he killed, the prisoners he captured, the rewards he received. But it provides crucial details about campaign's scope and objectives. A second autobiography, inscribed in the tomb of another soldier named Ahmose Pen-Nekbet at the same town of El Kab, provides additional information. Pen-Nekbet served under 5 successive pharaohs, an extraordinarily long military career that spanned at least 5 decades, and that made him one of the most experienced soldiers in Egyptian history, from Ahmose I through Thutmose III, and his tomb inscription records his participation in campaigns across the entire range of the Egyptian military theatre, from Nubia to the Euphrates. His account, laconic and soldier-like, confirms that Thutmose I personally led the expedition to the Euphrates, and that the campaign involved the defeat of the kingdom of Mitanni, a powerful Hurrian state whose territory encompassed much of modern northeastern Syria, southeastern Turkey, and northern Iraq. The Mitanni were not a minor power. They were one of the great civilizations of the Bronze Age Near East, a kingdom that controlled vital trade routes, maintained a powerful chariot army, and would remain Egypt's principal rival in the Levant for the next century and a half. The distance from Thebes to the Euphrates, roughly 1,400 kilometers as a modern crow would fly, but considerably more by the winding roads and mountain passes that an ancient army would have had to follow, required weeks of continuous marching. The army, like all pre-modern armies, moved at a pace dictated by the slowest elements. The infantry, who marched on foot at approximately 20 to 30 kilometers per day, and the supply wagons, which were even slower on rough terrain. The total journey, including rest days, resupply stops, and the time needed to negotiate or fight through hostile territory, may have taken 2 to 3 months in each direction, a logistical commitment that required the careful management of food supplies, water sources, and the political relationships with the Levantine city-states that controlled the army's route of march. Any disruption of the supply line, a blocked pass, a hostile city that refused to provide food and water, a surprise attack on the baggage train could have turned the expedition from a triumph into a disaster. The fact that the campaign succeeded, that the army reached the Euphrates intact and in fighting condition, is as much a testament to Thutmose's logistical planning as to his tactical skill. The campaign itself appears to have been swift and devastating. Thutmose moved his army northward along the Levantine coast, receiving the submission of some city-states and defeating others in battle. Upon reaching northern Syria, he encountered the forces of Mitanni and defeated them. The details of the battle are sparse, but the outcome was clear enough for Thutmose to proceed to the Euphrates, where he erected a boundary stela marking the furthest extent of Egyptian sovereignty. The stela, a carved stone monument declaring the pharaoh's dominion over the lands he had crossed, was the Bronze Age equivalent of planting a flag on conquered territory. It announced to the world that Egypt's writ now extended from the cataracts of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, a territory of more than 2,000 kilometers from south to north, encompassing the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline and reaching into the heartland of Mesopotamia. The northern campaign also included a famous and widely celebrated elephant hunt in the region of Ni, a city in the Orontes Valley of Syria, that became one of the legendary stories of Thutmose's reign. The king's participation in the hunt, which involved the pursuit and killing of at least 120 elephants, animals that still roamed the forests and marshlands of Syria in the 2nd millennium BC, but that would be hunted to extinction in the region within a few centuries, was both a display of royal prowess and a practical exercise in the logistics of operating in foreign territory. The hunt provided ivory, a luxury material that was prized throughout the ancient world, and it demonstrated the pharaoh's willingness to engage personally with the physical challenges of the foreign landscape. The elephants of Syria, a subspecies of the Asian elephant that was smaller than the African elephant but still formidable, represented a resource and a danger that the Egyptians had not previously encountered. The ivory from these elephants was a luxury commodity that commanded high prices throughout the Near East, and the control of the elephant hunting grounds was an economic prize worth fighting for. But the elephants were also dangerous. Wild animals capable of killing a man or overturning a chariot with a single charge. Thutmose's willingness to hunt them personally was a statement of the kind of kingship he practiced. A kingship that was not confined to the throne room or the temple, but that extended to the physical engagement with the world in all its danger and complexity. Later pharaohs, particularly Thutmose III, would repeat the elephant hunts at Ni as a demonstration of continuity with the achievements of their illustrious predecessor. The erection of the boundary stela at the Euphrates was a moment of extraordinary symbolic power, and the Egyptians knew it. For a civilization that had spent 15 centuries focused on the Nile Valley, a civilization whose entire cosmological framework was built around the single river that flowed from south to north, that flooded predictably, that sustained all life and defined all direction, the encounter with a great river that flowed the other way was genuinely disorienting. The Euphrates challenged the Egyptian understanding of the natural order. It was a reminder, more vivid than any foreign army or foreign fortress, that the world was not organized according to Egyptian principles, that the cosmos was larger and stranger than the Egyptian theological system had imagined, and that the order of the Nile Valley was not universal but local, not eternal but particular, not divine but geographical. The Egyptian phrase for the Euphrates, that inverted water, or that water which goes downstream in going upstream, captures this disorientation perfectly. The phrase became embedded in Egyptian geographical terminology, used for centuries afterward whenever the Euphrates was mentioned in inscriptions, texts, or administrative documents. It is a phrase that reveals, in its linguistic awkwardness, the cognitive challenge that the river posed to the Egyptian worldview, the difficulty of fitting a south-flowing river into a conceptual framework that assumed all rivers flowed north. And it is a phrase that carries, beneath its surface, a deeper significance. The recognition that the world beyond Egypt operated by rules that Egypt had not written and could not control. But here is the problem that would define not just Thutmose's reign, but the entire subsequent history of the New Kingdom Empire. Reaching the Euphrates was one thing. Holding the territory between the Euphrates and the Nile was quite another. The lands that Thutmose had marched through, the coastal cities, the mountain passes, the inland valleys, the desert crossroads, were not empty spaces. They were home to dozens of city-states, each with its own ruler, its own army, its own alliances, and its own interests. The political landscape of the Levant in the 15th century BC was one of the most complex in the ancient world, a patchwork of city-states, each governed by a local ruler who owed nominal allegiance to one or another of the great powers, but whose primary loyalty was to his own survival and the prosperity of his own city. The city-state of Megiddo, which controlled the strategic pass through the Carmel Range, and which would become, under Thutmose III, the site of one of the most famous battles in ancient history, was typical of the Levantine political landscape, a small, wealthy, militarily significant polity whose ruler navigated the competing demands of Egypt, Mitanni, and the other great powers with a combination of diplomacy, tribute, and the judicious application of military force. These city-states had submitted to Thutmose's army because they had no choice, because the Egyptian military force that had appeared on their doorsteps was too powerful to resist. But their submission was tactical, not strategic. The moment the Egyptian army withdrew, the moment the pharaoh turned his chariot southward and began the long march home, the city-states that had bowed and paid tribute would begin calculating their options, weighing the cost of continued submission against the potential benefits of rebellion, and testing the limits of Egyptian power in a region that was far from the Nile Valley and difficult to control from a distance. The administration of this vast territory, a territory that stretched across multiple climate zones, multiple cultural regions, and multiple political traditions, posed challenges that the Egyptian administrative system, sophisticated as it was, had never faced. In Nubia, the problem was relatively straightforward. The territory was thinly populated, the resources were concentrated in the Nile Valley and the gold mining regions, and the indigenous population could be controlled through a combination of military force and administrative integration. The Viceroy of Kush, backed by Egyptian garrisons and governing from established Egyptian bases, could maintain order across the province with a reasonable level of effort and expense. The Levant was a different matter entirely. The challenges of governing the Levantine vassal states were fundamentally different from those of governing Nubia, and the new kingdom would spend 4 centuries developing, refining, and ultimately failing to perfect a system of imperial governance that could manage the region's extraordinary complexity. The Levant was densely populated, politically fragmented, and culturally diverse. The region was densely populated, politically fragmented, and culturally diverse. A mosaic of city-states, tribal territories, and nomadic populations that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and maintained a bewildering web of alliances, rivalries, and blood feuds that an Egyptian administrator could barely comprehend, let alone manage. The solution that the new kingdom would eventually develop, a system of vassal relationships, known in modern scholarship as the garrison and vassal model, in which local rulers retained their thrones and their domestic authority, but pledged loyalty to the pharaoh, paid tribute, and accepted Egyptian advisors who monitored their compliance, was still in its infancy during Thutmose's reign. The system would be refined by his successors, particularly by his grandson Thutmose III, who would conduct 17 campaigns in the Levant over a period of 20 years and who would develop the administrative machinery of empire to its highest level of sophistication. The Amarna letters, though they date from approximately a century after Thutmose's death, provide the most detailed picture of how the vassal system actually functioned in practice. The letters show local rulers writing to the pharaoh in tones that range from abject submission to barely concealed insubordination, reporting on the activities of their neighbors, requesting military assistance against rivals, accusing each other of disloyalty, and pleading for the pharaoh's personal attention to disputes that the local Egyptian representatives could not or would not resolve. The picture that emerges is one of chronic instability, a system that required constant management, constant attention, and the constant threat of military intervention to maintain even a semblance of order. The vassal system was not a self-sustaining mechanism. It was a high-maintenance arrangement that consumed the attention and the resources of the Egyptian state on a continuous basis. But the basic framework, the idea that Egypt could control distant territories through a combination of periodic military campaigns, vassal relationships, and the selective use of force was established by Thutmose I. And it gets worse. Because the maintenance of the Northern Empire required Egypt to engage with the international system of the Bronze Age Near East, a system of great powers, rivalries, and diplomatic protocols that was far more complex and far more dangerous than anything the Egyptians had previously encountered. The kingdom of Mitanni, which controlled the upper Euphrates Valley, was not merely a local power that could be intimidated by a single campaign. It was a great power, a state with a professional army, a sophisticated administration, and diplomatic connections that extended from the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. Thutmose's victory over the Mitanni was impressive, but it was not decisive. The Mitanni would remain a formidable rival for generations, challenging Egyptian control of the Levant and supporting anti-Egyptian rebellions among the vassal states. To the north and east, the Hittite Empire, based in central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, was beginning its rise to great power status. To the east, the Babylonian and Assyrian kingdoms were watching the expansion of Egyptian power with a mixture of interest and alarm. The Kazite rulers of Babylon were consolidating their control over southern Mesopotamia and beginning to project influence westward. The Elamite kingdom in modern Iran maintained its independence on the eastern edge of the Mesopotamian world. And beyond these established powers, smaller kingdoms and city-states, the Hurrian principalities, the Canaanite city-states, the emerging Phoenician trading cities, were constantly shifting their allegiances in response to the changing balance of power among the great states. Egypt was entering a world of permanent great power competition, a world in which military strength alone was not sufficient, in which diplomacy, intelligence, and the management of complex international relationships were as important as the ability to win battles. Thutmose I did not live long enough to fully develop the administrative and diplomatic infrastructure that his conquests required. His reign was relatively short, perhaps 12 to 15 years, and much of it was consumed by the military campaigns themselves. The work of building the empire's administrative apparatus, the vassal system, the tribute networks, the diplomatic protocols, the garrison system, would fall to his successors, but the strategic vision was his. The idea that Egypt's security required the permanent projection of power beyond the Nile Valley, that the pharaoh must be not just the lord of the two lands, but the lord of a vast empire stretching from Africa to Asia, was Thutmose's contribution to Egyptian political thought. And it was a contribution that would shape the course of Egyptian history for the next 4 centuries. Every subsequent pharaoh who campaigned in the Levant, from Thutmose II, through the great conqueror Thutmose III, through the diplomats of the Amarna period, through the warriors of the Ramesside era, was following a path that Thutmose I had blazed. He did not know, when he planted his boundary stela on the banks of the Euphrates, that he was establishing a strategic commitment that would consume the resources and the attention of the Egyptian state for 400 years. He did not know that the empire he was founding would require a permanent military presence, a permanent diplomatic establishment, and a permanent expenditure of treasure that would, in the end, exhaust the civilization that sustained it. He knew only that the frontier must be pushed forward, that the buffer zone must be established, that the Hyksos nightmare must never be repeated. The rest, the centuries of imperial governance, the diplomatic intrigues, the great battles, the slow decline, was the future's problem. Thutmose's problem was the present, and in the present he had a river to cross and a world to conquer. The story of Thutmose I, the commoner who became pharaoh, the soldier who became an empire builder, the man who marched an Egyptian army to the banks of the Euphrates and looked upon a river that flowed the wrong way, is a story that has parallels across the entire sweep of military history. The figure of the soldier king who expands his kingdom's borders beyond anything his predecessors imagined, who projects power into regions his people had never seen, and who establishes the template for an empire that his successors will build upon. This figure appears again and again in the history of civilizations, and the comparison illuminates what Thutmose accomplished and what it cost. The most obvious parallel is Alexander the Great, who marched his Macedonian army from the shores of the Aegean to the banks of the Indus in the 4th century BC, a campaign that, like Thutmose's march to the Euphrates, pushed the boundaries of the known world and confronted its participants with the disorienting reality of a world far larger and stranger than they had imagined. Alexander, like Thutmose, was a soldier before he was a king, a man whose claim to the throne rested on his military ability as much as on his royal blood. Alexander, like Thutmose, combined personal courage with strategic brilliance, leading from the front in battles that could have killed him, and making tactical decisions that demonstrated an intuitive understanding of warfare that few commanders in history have matched. And Alexander, like Thutmose, died before the empire he had created could be consolidated, leaving his successors the task of building administrative structures capable of governing the vast territories he had conquered. But the differences between Alexander and Thutmose are as instructive as the similarities. The comparison between Alexander and Thutmose extends to the psychological dimension of empire building, the impact on the individual who leads the march into the unknown. Both men were driven by something that goes beyond ordinary ambition, a compulsion to push beyond every boundary, to reach every horizon, to see what lies on the other side of every mountain and every river. Alexander's famous weeping when he heard there were no more worlds to conquer may be apocryphal, but it captures a truth about the psychology of the empire builder, the restless, insatiable hunger for new frontiers that drives some individuals to accomplish things that reasonable people would never attempt. Thutmose, standing on the banks of the Euphrates, must have felt something similar. The exhilaration of having reached the edge of the known world, combined with the knowledge that the edge was merely a beginning, that beyond the Euphrates lay more lands, more peoples, more rivers, more challenges that the Egyptian civilization had never imagined, and that the pharaoh's lifetime would not be long enough to explore. Alexander's empire collapsed immediately upon his death, divided among his generals in a series of wars that fragmented the Macedonian conquests into rival successor states within a generation. Thutmose's empire, by contrast, endured for centuries, maintained and expanded by a succession of capable pharaohs who built upon Thutmose's strategic vision with an administrative sophistication that Alexander's successors never achieved. The difference lies in the institutional context. Alexander operated within a Macedonian political culture that was personal and charismatic. Power depended on the individual king's ability to command loyalty, and when the king died, the loyalty died with him. Thutmose operated within an Egyptian political culture that was institutional and bureaucratic. Power was embedded in the office of the pharaoh, in the administrative machinery of the state, and in the theological framework that gave the throne its authority. When Thutmose died, the system continued to function, because the system did not depend on Thutmose's personal charisma. It depended on the institutional structures that had been accumulating since the founding of the Egyptian state 3 millennia earlier. Let us consider a second parallel, one that illuminates the specific challenge of imperial expansion from a river valley civilization into a wider world. The Akkadian Empire, founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BC, represents the first known attempt at empire building in Mesopotamian history, and the parallels with Thutmose's achievement are striking. Sargon, like Thutmose I, was a man of humble origins who rose to power through military ability. According to Mesopotamian tradition, he was a cupbearer who overthrew his king and seized the throne. Like Thutmose I, he expanded his kingdom's territory far beyond its traditional borders, conquering the cities of Sumer to the south, the lands of Elam to the east, and the territories of the upper Euphrates to the northwest. And like Thutmose I, he established the strategic framework for an empire that his successors would maintain and expand, an empire that, at its peak under Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Akkadian parallel illuminates a fundamental challenge of empire building that Thutmose confronted, and that every imperial power in history has confronted: the challenge of controlling territory that is ethnically, linguistically, and culturally different from the imperial core. Sargon's Akkadians spoke a Semitic language and worshipped Semitic gods. The Sumerians they conquered spoke an unrelated language and maintained a distinct cultural tradition that resisted assimilation. The Akkadian Empire, the first known empire in history, if we define empire as the sustained control of a culturally diverse territory by a centralized government, offers a sobering lesson in the fragility of imperial power. The Akkadian Empire lasted approximately a century and a half, a remarkably short period that reflects the difficulty of maintaining centralized control over a culturally diverse territory. In the 3rd millennium BC, when the administrative and communications technologies available to rulers were far more limited than those of the 2nd millennium, the tension between Akkadian rule and Sumerian identity would destabilize the Akkadian Empire throughout its existence and would contribute to its eventual collapse. Thutmose's Egypt faced a similar challenge which in Levant, where the city-state spoke various Semitic languages. Canaanite, Amorite, Hurrian, worshipped diverse pantheons, and maintained cultural traditions that had nothing in common with the Egyptian civilization that now claimed sovereignty over them. The question of how to govern peoples who did not share the conqueror's language, religion, or cultural values was the central administrative challenge of the New Kingdom Empire, a challenge that was never fully resolved and that would contribute, in the long run, to the empire's eventual decline. The Egyptian administrators who governed the Levantine provinces never fully understood the societies they were trying to manage, never learned the local languages with sufficient fluency, never grasped the intricate web of tribal and clan loyalties that governed Levantine politics, never appreciated the degree to which the local populations resented the imposition of foreign authority, however benign it might appear from the Egyptian perspective. The gap between the conqueror's understanding and the conquered's reality is one of the permanent features of imperial governance, a gap that no amount of administrative sophistication can fully close, and that generates a persistent undercurrent of friction, resentment, and periodic revolt that drains the empire's resources and attention on a continuous basis. The problem was compounded by the distance between the Levantine provinces and the Egyptian capital, communications between the vassal states and the pharaoh's court at Thebes, which required the physical transportation of clay tablets across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain, could take weeks or even months. A crisis that erupted in a Levantine city-state might not reach the pharaoh's attention until weeks after it began, and the pharaoh's response might not reach the affected region for weeks more. In the meantime, the local Egyptian representative, typically a military officer with limited diplomatic skills and even more limited understanding of local politics, was expected to manage the situation with whatever resources were available. The results were predictable: chronic instability, frequent miscommunication, and a constant cycle of rebellion and repression that consumed the empire's military resources without ever achieving permanent pacification. Let us now turn to a comparison that reveals the cultural dimension of imperial expansion, the dimension that is often overlooked in military histories, but that was, for Thutmose I and his successors, as significant as the military dimension itself. The Roman expansion into the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC offers a striking parallel to the Egyptian expansion into the culturally sophisticated Levant. The Romans, like the Egyptians, were a military power expanding into a region that was, in many respects, culturally superior to the conquerors. The Greek cities of the Eastern Mediterranean had produced philosophy, drama, science, and art of a sophistication that the Romans could not match, and the Romans knew it. The Roman poet Horace famously observed that Greece, the captive, made her savage victor captive, a phrase that captures the paradox of a conqueror who is culturally transformed by the very civilization he has conquered. The same dynamic was at work in the Egyptian expansion into the Levant. The Levantine city-states were, in many respects, more culturally sophisticated than the Egyptian civilization that now claimed sovereignty over them. Their craftsmen produced metalwork, glasswork, and textile of a quality that Egyptian artisans could not match. Their merchants maintained commercial networks that stretched from the Nile to Mesopotamia, to the Aegean, networks that had been operating for centuries before the Egyptian army appeared on the horizon. Their scribes wrote in multiple languages: Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the Bronze Age, as well as the local Canaanite dialects that would eventually evolve into Phoenician and Hebrew. Their religious traditions, the worship of Baal, Astarte, El, and the other deities of the Canaanite pantheon, were as ancient and as elaborate as anything in Egypt. The Egyptians conquered these cities, but the cities, in their quiet way, conquered back, infiltrating the Egyptian imagination with their gods, their aesthetic sensibilities, their commercial practices, and their worldview in a process of cultural osmosis that the Egyptian elite could resist but could not prevent. The city-states of the Levantine coast, Byblos, Ugarit, Sidon, Tyre, were centers of trade, craftsmanship, and cultural production that rivaled anything in Egypt. Byblos, in particular, had maintained close commercial and cultural ties with Egypt since the Old Kingdom. Ties so deep that the Egyptian word for papyrus scroll, from which the Greek word biblos and the English word bible ultimately derive, may have been connected to the city's name. The cedar of Lebanon, the essential building material for Egyptian ships, coffins, and temple doors, came from the forests that cloaked the mountains above these coastal cities. The luxury goods that filled the tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs, gold and silver jewelry, carved ivory, faience vessels, fine textiles, were often produced by Levantine craftsmen whose technical skills were unsurpassed in the ancient world. The conquest of these territories brought Egypt into contact with a web of cultural influences that would transform Egyptian civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. Egyptian art, architecture, and decorative traditions absorbed Levantine motifs and techniques. Egyptian religion incorporated elements of Levantine mythology. The worship of the goddesses Astarte and Anat, imported from the Levant, became popular in New Kingdom Egypt, particularly among the military classes who had encountered these deities during their campaigns abroad. The Egyptian language borrowed Semitic words for concepts and objects that had no Egyptian equivalents, words for chariots, weapons, military ranks, and the administrative terminology of empire. The cultural exchange was, as it always is in imperial contexts, deeply asymmetrical. The conquered absorbed more from the conquerors than the conquerors absorbed from the conquered, but the conquerors were changed nonetheless. The Egyptians who came to the Levant as rulers left the Levant with new gods in their hearts, new words on their tongues, new aesthetic preferences in their eyes, and new assumptions about the world in their minds. The exchange was not one-directional. The Levantine city-states also absorbed Egyptian influences, creating a hybrid Mediterranean culture that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely Levantine, but a creative, hybrid synthesis that reflected the increasingly interconnected world that Thutmose's campaigns had helped to create. Let us consider one more comparison that brings a uniquely relevant perspective to the story of Thutmose's imperial achievement: the creation of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. Cyrus, like Thutmose, was a ruler who transformed a regional power into a world empire in the space of a single reign. The Persian kingdom of Anshan, a relatively modest state in the highlands of southwestern Iran, was, under Cyrus's leadership, expanded into an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India, encompassing more territory than any previous empire in history. Cyrus's campaigns, the conquest of Media, the defeat of Lydia, the capture of Babylon, were as rapid and as dramatic as Thutmose's march to the Euphrates, and they posed the same fundamental challenge: how to govern an empire that was ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse, that extended across vast distances, and that could not be held together by military force alone. Cyrus's solution was remarkably different from Thutmose's, and the difference illuminates the range of possible responses to the challenge of imperial governance. Where the Egyptian empire was hierarchical and centralized, with the pharaoh at the apex, the vizier beneath him, and a chain of appointed officials extending downward through the administrative hierarchy. The Persian Empire was federal and decentralized. Cyrus allowed conquered peoples to retain their own laws, their own religions, and their own local rulers, requiring only that they acknowledge Persian sovereignty, pay tribute, and supply military contingents when called upon. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often described as the first charter of human rights, declares that Cyrus restored the gods of conquered peoples to their temples, respected local customs, and ruled through consent rather than coercion. The contrast with the Egyptian approach, which imposed Egyptian gods, Egyptian language, and Egyptian administrative practices on conquered territories, could not be more stark. The Persian approach produced an empire that was, in some respects, more stable and more durable than the Egyptian one. The Achaemenid Empire lasted approximately 2 centuries, from Cyrus's conquests in the mid-6th century BC to Alexander's conquest in 331 BC, and during that period, it governed a territory of unprecedented size, with a level of efficiency and tolerance that earned the grudging respect even of the Greeks, who were the Persians' most persistent enemies. The Egyptian New Kingdom Empire lasted approximately 4 centuries, longer than the Persian Empire, but it required a level of military effort and administrative investment that the Persian system, with its reliance on local autonomy and consensual governance, was able to avoid. The lesson is clear, though the ancient Egyptians could not have articulated it. There is more than one way to build an empire. The Egyptian way, centralized, hierarchical, culturally assertive, produces tight control but high costs. The Persian way, decentralized, federal, culturally tolerant, produces looser control but lower costs. Both approaches have their strengths and their vulnerabilities, and neither has proven universally superior across the sweep of human history. Thutmose chose the Egyptian way because it was the only way his civilization knew, because the theological framework of pharaonic kingship demanded centralized divine authority, and because the memory of the Hyksos made cultural tolerance of foreigners ideologically impossible for a civilization that defined its identity in opposition to foreign rule. The choice was understandable, rooted in the deepest assumptions of Egyptian civilization and reinforced by the traumatic memory of the Hyksos, which made cultural tolerance of foreigners feel not like enlightened policy, but like the first step toward another conquest. But it was also costly, and the costs would accumulate, generation after generation, until the empire could no longer sustain them. But the most profound cultural consequence of Thutmose's imperial expansion was the transformation of the pharaonic ideology itself. Before Thutmose's, the pharaoh had been the lord of the 2 lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, the Nile Valley from the cataracts to the delta. After Thutmose, the pharaoh was something more, the lord of an empire, the ruler of foreign lands, the commander of armies that fought on distant battlefields in the service of a geopolitical strategy that the Middle Kingdom pharaohs could not have conceived. The royal titulary, the elaborate sequence of names and titles that every pharaoh bore, was expanded to include references to foreign conquests and universal dominion. The temple reliefs that depicted the pharaoh's achievements now showed scenes of foreign warfare. The charging chariot, the defeated enemy, the bound prisoners, the submission of foreign rulers that became the standard vocabulary of New Kingdom royal art. The pharaoh was no longer merely a divine administrator maintaining Mat within the borders of Egypt. He was a warrior emperor projecting divine power across the known world. Let us consider one final comparison that brings the story of Thutmose's imperial expansion into particularly sharp focus: the Japanese expansion into East Asia and the Pacific in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Japan, like Egypt, was an island civilization, geographically isolated, culturally distinct, and accustomed to viewing the outside world through the lens of its own cultural superiority. Like Egypt, Japan experienced a traumatic encounter with foreign power. The arrival of Commodore Perry's warships in 1853, which demonstrated that Japan's military technology was hopelessly outdated, and that the country's 250-year policy of isolation had left it vulnerable to conquest by the technologically superior Western powers. And like Egypt after the Hyksos, Japan's response to this traumatic encounter was not retreat but transformation, a rapid, comprehensive modernization of the military, the economy, and the political system that transformed Japan within a single generation from a feudal kingdom into a modern industrial state capable of projecting military power across the Pacific. The parallels with Thutmose's Egypt are striking. The Meiji Restoration of 1868, the political revolution that launched Japan's modernization, was driven by the same combination of national humiliation and strategic anxiety that drove the new kingdom's imperial expansion. The Japanese elite, like the Egyptian elite after the Hyksos, understood that their civilization's survival depended on its ability to adopt the military technology and the strategic methods of the powers that threatened it. Japan adopted Western weapons, Western military organization, Western industrial techniques, and Western diplomatic protocols with a speed and thoroughness that astonished the Western powers themselves. Within 40 years of the Meiji Restoration, Japan had defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 and Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Victories that announced Japan's arrival as a great power, and that paralleled, in their strategic significance, Thutmose's victory over Mitanni and his march to the Euphrates. The Japanese comparison also illuminates the danger of imperial overextension, the trap that every expanding power eventually falls into. Japan's imperial expansion in the first half of the 20th century, the conquest of Manchuria, the invasion of China, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the subsequent campaign across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, was driven by the same logic of forward defense that had driven the new kingdom's expansion into the Levant, the belief that national security required the control of strategic resources and the creation of a defensive perimeter that would protect the homeland from external attack. The result, as in the Egyptian case, was an empire that was too large to sustain, a military commitment that exceeded the nation's economic capacity, and that led, ultimately, to catastrophic defeat. The Japanese example also illuminates the cultural dimension of imperial overextension. Japan's military expansion was accompanied by an ideology of racial and cultural superiority, the belief that the Japanese people had a divine mission to lead and civilize the other peoples of Asia. This ideology, like the Egyptian ideology of pharaonic supremacy, served as both a motivation for expansion and a barrier to the kind of cultural accommodation that might have made the empire more sustainable. The conquered peoples of Asia did not accept Japanese rule because they did not accept the premise on which it was based, the premise that the Japanese were inherently superior and that submission to Japanese authority was a moral obligation. The same dynamic was at work in the Egyptian Empire, where the conquered peoples of the Levant and Nubia accepted Egyptian rule as a political necessity, but never accepted the Egyptian claim to cultural and divine superiority. The resistance was passive rather than active, a slow, corrosive skepticism that undermined the empire's foundations without ever directly challenging its military power. The parallel is not exact, no historical parallel ever is, but the underlying dynamic is identical. The pursuit of absolute security through territorial expansion produces, in the end, the very insecurity it was designed to prevent. The Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, writing in the early 20th century, described Thutmose I as the first great military genius of history. A judgment that was perhaps overstated, but that captures the genuine significance of what Thutmose I accomplished. The modern Egyptologist Betsy Bryan has offered a more measured assessment, describing Thutmose as the pharaoh who established the paradigm of New Kingdom imperialism, a judgment that focuses not on individual genius, but on institutional innovation, not on personal heroism, but on the creation of a strategic framework that would guide Egyptian policy for centuries. Both assessments are valid. Thutmose was both a military genius and an institutional innovator, a man whose personal courage on the battlefield was matched by his strategic vision, and whose tactical achievements were embedded in an administrative framework that gave them lasting significance. The distinction between the two assessments, Breasted's emphasis on individual genius, Bryan's emphasis on institutional innovation, reflects a broader debate in historical scholarship about the relative importance of individual agency and structural forces in shaping historical outcomes. Was Thutmose a great man who bent history to his will, or was he a capable individual who happened to occupy the right position at the right time riding a wave of institutional development and strategic necessity that would have produced something like the New Kingdom Empire, regardless of who sat on the throne. The truth, as always in such debates, lies somewhere in between. The institutional conditions for imperial expansion were in place before Thutmose I came to power. The professional army, the post-Hyksos military culture, the strategic anxiety that demanded forward defense. But the decision to march to the Euphrates, the specific, personal, irreducible decision to push the boundaries of the Egyptian state further than any previous pharaoh had imagined, was Thutmose's alone. History provides the conditions, individuals provide the spark, and without the spark, the conditions remain merely potential, unrealized, unactualized, forever waiting for the man or woman who will set them ablaze. Before Thutmose I, no Egyptian pharaoh had conceived of an empire extending beyond the Nile Valley and its immediate environs. After Thutmose I, the empire was an accomplished fact, and the maintenance and expansion of that empire became the central preoccupation of the Egyptian state for the next 4 centuries. The campaigns of Thutmose III, who would fight the famous Battle of Megiddo, the first battle in history to be recorded in sufficient detail for modern military analysts to reconstruct its tactics, were direct extensions of his grandfather's strategic vision. The diplomatic system of the Amarna period, revealed in the extraordinary cache of letters found at Akhenaten's abandoned capital, was the administrative refinement of the imperial framework that Thutmose I had established. The great battles of the Ramesside era, Kadesh, the Sea Peoples campaigns, the Libyan wars, were fought to defend an empire whose boundaries had been drawn, in their essentials, by Thutmose I. The shadow of the soldier pharaoh who marched to the Euphrates extended across 4 centuries of Egyptian history, a shadow so long and so profound that every subsequent pharaoh defined his achievements, at least in part, by reference to the standard that Thutmose had set. The strategic vision that Thutmose articulated, the idea that Egypt's security required the permanent projection of power into the Levant, the maintenance of a buffer zone of vassal states between the Nile Valley and the great powers of the Near East, and the continuous, expensive, logistically demanding deployment of military force to deter potential aggressors and to maintain the credibility of Egyptian power in a competitive international environment, would guide Egyptian foreign policy until the end of the New Kingdom and beyond. Every pharaoh who followed Thutmose I, from his son Thutmose II through his grandson Thutmose III, through the Amarna period and the Ramessides and the final decline of the 20th Dynasty, operated within the strategic framework that Thutmose I had established. The transformation that Thutmose wrought can be compared, in its scale and significance, to the Chinese expansion under the Han Dynasty's Emperor Wu in the 2nd century BC. Emperor Wu, like Thutmose, inherited a kingdom that was militarily strong but geographically limited. The Han state controlled the Chinese heartland but had not yet projected power into the vast territories of Central Asia, Korea, or Vietnam that would eventually constitute the Han Empire's periphery. Wu's campaigns, the wars against the Xiongnu nomads, the opening of the Silk Road, the conquest of the Nanyue Kingdom in modern Vietnam, expanded the territorial extent of the Chinese state by a factor comparable to Thutmose's expansion of Egypt. And like Thutmose, Wu created an imperial framework, a system of commanderies, vassal relationships, and frontier garrisons that would define Chinese statecraft for centuries. The strategic logic was identical: forward defense against nomadic threats, control of vital trade routes, and the projection of civilizational prestige into regions that had previously been beyond the empire's reach. The Han comparison is particularly instructive because it illustrates a universal principle of empire building. The transition from kingdom to empire is not merely a matter of scale but of kind. An empire is not just a bigger kingdom, it is a different kind of political entity, one that faces different challenges, requires different institutions, and operates by different rules. Thutmose understood this intuitively, even if he could not have articulated it theoretically. A kingdom defends its borders, an empire defends its interests, and its interests extend far beyond its borders into territories that are culturally foreign, strategically complex, and logistically challenging to control. The management of an empire requires institutions that a kingdom does not need. Diplomatic services, intelligence networks, colonial administrations, permanent garrisons in foreign territories, tribute collection systems, mechanisms for managing the competing demands of diverse subject populations. Thutmose created the first versions of all of these institutions, crude perhaps by the standards that his successors would establish, but recognizable as the foundations of the imperial apparatus that the new kingdom would deploy across the eastern Mediterranean for the next 4 centuries. The transition from kingdom to empire also changed the relationship between the pharaoh and his people. In a kingdom, the pharaoh's primary obligation is to his own subjects, to maintain mat within the borders of the Nile Valley, to ensure the regularity of the floods, the success of the harvests, and the stability of the social order. In an empire, the pharaoh's obligations extend outward to the vassal states that depend on his protection, to the garrison towns that depend on his supply, to the diplomatic relationships that depend on his attention, to the military campaigns that depend on his leadership. The empire demanded that the pharaoh look outward, and the outward gaze, sustained across generations, changed the character of the pharaonic office itself. The pharaoh was no longer merely a divine administrator. He was a warrior, a diplomat, a strategist, and an imperial ruler whose responsibility extended across 2 continents and whose decisions affected millions of people who had never seen the Nile and never would. The numbers are striking when you consider the scale of the transformation. Before Thutmose, Egypt controlled approximately 1,000 kilometers of the Nile Valley, from the first cataract to the Delta coast. After Thutmose, Egypt controlled, or claimed to control, a territory of more than 2,000 kilometers from north to south, encompassing the Nile Valley, Lower Nubia, Upper Nubia to the Fourth Cataract, the Sinai, the Levantine coast, and the inland territories of Syria, as far as the Euphrates. The territory under Egyptian sovereignty or influence had more than doubled in a single reign. The population under Egyptian control had increased by millions. The pharaoh's court was transformed from a regional center of power into an imperial capital, a city that received ambassadors from foreign kings, that processed tribute from subject peoples across 2 continents, that administered a military and economic network of staggering complexity. The economic resources available to the pharaoh, gold from Nubia, timber from Lebanon, tribute from the Levantine city-states, trade goods from across the Near East, had multiplied many times over. Egypt had been transformed, in the space of a decade and a half, from a wealthy Nile Valley kingdom into a territorial empire of unprecedented scale. And now we arrive at the question that lies beneath all the military campaigns and the administrative innovations and the strategic calculations. The question that becomes audible only when the trumpets fall silent and the dust of the chariots settles and the inscriptions are carved and the temples are dedicated, and the pharaoh, at the end of the day, is alone with the knowledge of what he has done and what it has cost. What does it mean to look upon a river that flows the wrong way? The question is not merely geographical, it is existential. The Euphrates, that inverted water, as the Egyptian scribes called it in their bewildered, inadequate, unforgettable phrase, was more than a boundary marker. It was a revelation. It was the moment when Egyptian civilization, which had spent 15 centuries developing a cosmological system based on the assumption that its own experience was universal, that the way the Nile flowed was the way all rivers flowed, that the order of the Egyptian world was the order of the world itself, was forced to confront the fact that its assumptions were local, particular, and incomplete. The world did not operate by Egyptian rules. The world had its own rules. Rules that were as valid and as ancient as the rules of the Nile Valley, but that were fundamentally different. The Euphrates flowed south, not because the cosmic order was broken, but because the cosmic order, if such a thing existed, was far more complex and far more varied than the Egyptian theological system had imagined. The stars above the Euphrates were the same stars that shone above Thebes, but they were seen from a different angle, in a different context, in a landscape that was not the landscape the Egyptian creation myths described. The gods of Mitanni were not the gods of Egypt, but they were gods nonetheless, worshipped with devotion by millions of people who believed in them as sincerely as the Egyptians believed in Amun and Ra and Osiris. The cosmos was not organized according to Egyptian principles. The order that the Egyptians had built, the mat that they maintained through ritual and governance, and the pharaoh's divine authority was not a universal truth, but a local achievement, valid within the borders of the Nile Valley, but meaningless on the banks of a river that flowed in the direction that the Egyptian cosmology said was impossible. Let that sink in. A civilization that had believed, for more than a millennium, that its understanding of the world was the understanding of the world, that its gods were the gods, that its river was the river, that its order was the order, was told, by the brute and undeniable fact of a great south-flowing river, that it was wrong, fundamentally, cosmologically, irreversibly wrong. Not wrong about a detail, wrong about a fundamental assumption, the assumption that the Egyptian experience, the Egyptian Nile, the Egyptian gods, the Egyptian way of organizing the cosmos, was the universal standard against which all other experiences should be measured. The Euphrates did not merely challenge Egyptian geography. It did not merely force the Egyptian mapmakers to redraw their charts. It challenged Egyptian theology. It challenged the assumption that the gods had created the world according to the pattern that the Egyptians knew, that the divine order reflected in the Nile Valley was the divine order of the cosmos, that the way things worked in Egypt was the way things worked everywhere. The discovery that this assumption was wrong, that the world contained rivers that flowed in the opposite direction, mountains that dwarfed the cliffs of the Nile Valley, forests that covered more territory than the entire cultivated area of Egypt, peoples whose languages were as old and as complex as Egyptian but utterly unlike it, was a discovery that should, logically, have prompted a fundamental revision of the Egyptian cosmological system. It did not. The Egyptians absorbed the information and moved on, their cosmology intact, their theology unrevised, their sense of civilizational superiority undented. It challenged the entire framework of meaning within which the Egyptians understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. The response to this challenge, the way the Egyptians processed the cognitive dissonance of a world that did not conform to their expectations, reveals something essential about the nature of imperial civilizations. The Egyptians did not abandon their cosmological system. They did not revise their theology to accommodate the new information. They did not question the authority of the pharaoh or the validity of Mat. Instead, they incorporated the anomaly into their existing framework, translating the strangeness of the Euphrates into Egyptian categories, calling it that inverted water, and treating its flow as a curiosity rather than a contradiction. The world was strange and large and often incomprehensible. But the gods were still Egyptian. The pharaoh was still the lord of creation. Mat still governed the universe. The Euphrates was merely an oddity, a reminder that the edges of the world were peculiar and disorderly, and that the pharaoh's task of maintaining cosmic order was even more challenging than previously understood. This capacity for absorbing anomalies without surrendering core beliefs is one of the defining characteristics of imperial civilizations, and it is both a strength and a weakness. It is a strength because it allows the civilization to expand into unfamiliar territories without losing its sense of identity. An Egyptian soldier standing on the banks of the Euphrates was still an Egyptian, still a servant of the pharaoh, still a worshipper of Amun, still a citizen of the land that the gods had created at the beginning of time. The strangeness and the disorientation of the foreign world did not diminish his Egyptianness. If anything, it reinforced it. The contrast between the order of Egypt and the disorder of the foreign lands made the Egyptian identity more precious, more defined, more worth defending. But it is also a weakness. And here is where the story of Thutmose becomes not merely a military narrative, but a meditation on the limits of civilizational thinking. Because the refusal to question core assumptions in the face of contradictory evidence is a form of intellectual rigidity that limits a civilization's ability to learn and adapt. The Egyptians never developed a geographical science that could account for the diversity of the world they had encountered. never produced the equivalent of Herodotus's geographical descriptions, or Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth's circumference. They never developed a political philosophy that could accommodate the legitimate sovereignty of non-Egyptian peoples, never acknowledged that the Mitanni or the Hittites or the Babylonians had as much right to exist as Egypt did. Their world maps, such as they were, placed Egypt at the center of creation, surrounded by foreign peoples who were depicted, in the temple reliefs, as bound prisoners groveling beneath the pharaoh's feet. The reality that the Euphrates revealed, the reality of a world in which Egypt was merely one power among several, in which the pharaoh's authority was contested and conditional, in which the gods of other peoples were as real and as powerful as the gods of Egypt, was a reality that the Egyptian theological system could not accommodate. And so it was not accommodated. It was absorbed, translated, domesticated, turned from a challenge into a curiosity, from a revelation into an anecdote, from a potentially transformative encounter into a footnote in the triumph narrative that the Egyptian scribes composed for the temple walls. They maintained, until the end of their civilization, the theological fiction that the pharaoh was the lord of all creation, and that all foreign peoples were, by definition, enemies of Ma'at who existed only to be subdued and exploited. This rigidity, this refusal to update the operating system even as the hardware expanded, would eventually contribute to the empire's decline as the gap between the Egyptian worldview and the reality of the international system grew wider with each passing generation. Thutmose I stood at the beginning of this process, at the moment when the Egyptian worldview first encountered a world that was too large and too complex to be contained within its traditional categories. He did not resolve the contradiction. He could not have done so. The conceptual tools for resolving it did not exist in his civilization and would not be developed for many centuries in other civilizations under very different circumstances. But he opened the door wide, irreversibly, and with consequences that would echo for millennia. He showed Egypt that the world extended far beyond the Nile Valley, that powerful kingdoms existed in every direction, and that the pharaoh's claim to universal sovereignty, the theological assertion that the son of Ra was the lord of all creation, that every land and every people belonged by divine right to the pharaoh of Egypt, would have to be maintained by force, continuously, against rivals who had their own claims to divine authority and their own armies to back them up. The empire that Thutmose created was, in this sense, not just a political and military achievement. It was an intellectual challenge, a confrontation with complexity that the Egyptian civilizational framework was not equipped to handle, but that it could not avoid. Something is wrong with our assumptions when we imagine that ancient civilizations existed in isolation, that the Egyptians lived in their river valley, the Mesopotamians in theirs, and that these civilizations developed independently, like organisms in separate petri dishes, unaware of and unaffected by each other's existence. The reality, as Thutmose's campaigns demonstrate, is that the civilizations of the Bronze Age were interconnected, linked by trade routes, diplomatic relationships, and military rivalries that created a web of mutual influence and mutual vulnerability that spanned the entire Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. The tin that Egyptian bronze smiths used to make their weapons came from mines in Central Asia, transported along trade routes that passed through Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Eastern Mediterranean, before reaching the workshops of the Nile Valley. The lapis lazuli that adorned the jewelry of the pharaohs came from mines in Afghanistan, more than 4,000 kilometers from Egypt. The gold that Egypt exported to its trading partners and diplomatic allies came from Nubian mines that were worked by Egyptian-controlled labor forces. The cedar of Lebanon that built Egyptian ships and coffins and temple doors came from forests that were controlled, during the New Kingdom, by Egyptian vassal states. The entire economic infrastructure of the New Kingdom Empire was built on a web of international trade that connected Egypt to the farthest corners of the known world, a web that Thutmose's campaigns had helped to create and that his successors would fight to maintain for centuries. Thutmose's march to the Euphrates was not an isolated event. It was a move in a geopolitical game that involved multiple great powers, Egypt, Mitanni, the Hittites, Babylon, Assyria, each with its own strategic objectives, its own military capabilities, its own diplomatic ambitions, each responding to the actions of the others, each trying to maximize its own security and influence in a competitive and dangerous world. This is not science fiction. This is the documented reality of Bronze Age international relations, a reality that was, in many respects, as complex and as dangerous as the international system of the modern world. The interconnectedness of the Bronze Age world is one of the most important discoveries of modern archaeology, and one of the most surprising given the popular image of ancient civilizations as isolated kingdoms separated by impassable barriers of desert, mountain, and sea. The work of scholars like Eric Klein, whose study, 1491 BC, the year civilization collapsed, has brought the complexity of Bronze Age international relations to a wider audience, has demonstrated that the civilizations of the second millennium BC were linked in a system of trade, diplomacy, and mutual influence that was, in many respects, as sophisticated and as interconnected as the international system of the modern world. The Amarna letters, discovered in 1887 at the site of the city that the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten built in the 14th century BC, reveal a world of elaborate, sophisticated, permanent diplomacy, of royal marriages, trade agreements, military alliances, mutual assistance pacts, and elaborate diplomatic protocols that connected the great powers of the Near East in a system of relationships that was as intricate as any in the modern world. The letters show pharaohs exchanging gifts with Babylonian and Assyrian kings, negotiating the terms of diplomatic marriages, complaining about the quality of gold sent by foreign rulers, and managing the competing demands of vassal states that played the great powers against each other with a sophistication that would have impressed a modern diplomat. Thutmose I did not see this world in its full complexity. The Amarna system would not reach its mature form until a century after his death, but he opened the door to it. By marching to the Euphrates, he brought Egypt into direct contact with the great powers of the Near East and initiated the process of diplomatic and military engagement that would define the new kingdom for the next 4 centuries. The world that Thutmose revealed to Egypt was a world of permanent competition, permanent danger, and permanent opportunity, a world in which the pharaoh could not merely sit on his throne and maintain mart within the borders of the Nile Valley, but had to actively engage with foreign powers, manage complex alliances, and project military force across vast distances to protect the interests of the Egyptian state. The isolation of the Old and Middle Kingdoms was over. Egypt was now a player in a global game, and the game would never end. We have followed Thutmose I from the banks of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, from the capital at Thebes to the frontier of the known world. We have seen how a soldier of non-royal blood became the architect of the greatest territorial expansion in Egyptian history, pushing the boundaries of the Egyptian state from the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. We have seen how his campaigns established the strategic framework, the idea of forward defense, the system of vassal states, the projection of military power into the Levant and Nubia that would guide Egyptian imperial policy for the next 4 centuries. And we have seen, in the comparison with other empire builders, Alexander, Sargon, the Romans, that the challenges Thutmose faced were universal challenges, inherent in the very nature of imperial expansion, and relevant to every civilization that has attempted to project power beyond its natural borders. What does this story mean? Not for Egyptology, not for military history, not for the specialized academic debates about Bronze Age chronology and chariot technology and the administrative structures of the New Kingdom, but for the person listening to these words in the quiet of the night, lying in the dark, thinking about a world that is larger and more frightening and more magnificent than the maps we carry in our heads. It means, first, that the world is always larger than we think it is. The Egyptians believed, for 15 centuries, that they understood the world, that the Nile Valley was the center of creation, that the desert barriers were impregnable, that the cosmic order they maintained was universal and eternal. Thutmose showed them that they were wrong. that the world extended far beyond the Nile Valley, that powerful civilizations existed in every direction, and that the Egyptian experience, however magnificent, was merely one thread in a tapestry of human achievement that spanned continents and millennia. The river that flowed the wrong way was a reminder, a physical, geographical, undeniable reminder, that the assumptions we hold most deeply are often the assumptions we need to question most urgently. The river that flows the wrong way is not just a river. It is a metaphor for every moment in which a civilization, an institution, or an individual encounters a reality that does not fit the established framework of understanding. The question is never whether such moments will come. They always do. The question is how the encounter is processed, whether the anomaly is absorbed into the existing framework without disturbing it, or whether it prompts a genuine revision of the framework itself. The Egyptians chose absorption. They called the Euphrates that inverted water and moved on. They did not ask why the river flowed south. They did not develop a theory of geography that could explain the diversity of river systems across the ancient world. They did not send expeditions to map the course of the Euphrates, to determine where it rose and where it emptied, to understand the hydrological system that produced a great river flowing in the wrong direction. They did not, in short, allow the encounter with the unknown to generate genuine knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from asking questions rather than from imposing answers. They did not wonder whether their cosmological assumption that all rivers flowed north was perhaps based on a sample size of one. They did not consider the possibility that their local experience might not be universal truth. And this failure of imagination, this inability to learn from the encounter with the unknown, would limit their capacity to adapt to a world that was changing faster than their conceptual framework could accommodate. It means, second, that security is never permanent. The Hyksos had taught Egypt that its borders could be breached. Thutmose I taught Egypt that the only way to prevent a second breach was to move the defense line forward, to create a buffer zone of subject territories and vassal states that would absorb any future threat before it reached the homeland. But the buffer zone itself created new vulnerabilities, new borders to defend, new populations to control, new rivals to manage, that required ever-increasing investments of military and administrative resources. This is the paradox that the political scientists call the security dilemma. The phenomenon in which the actions a state takes to increase its own security have the unintended effect of decreasing the security of other states, which respond by increasing their own military capacity, which in turn makes the first state feel less secure and prompts a further round of expansion. Thutmose's empire was, from the perspective of the great powers of the Near East, not a defensive measure but a threat, an aggressive expansion by a military superpower that destabilized the regional balance of power and forced other states to arm, ally, and prepare for a confrontation that might never come, but that could not be ruled out. The Mitanni response to Thutmose's campaigns was not submission but mobilization, the strengthening of their own military forces, the formation of alliances with other states threatened by Egyptian expansion, and the support of anti-Egyptian rebellions in the Levant that would keep the pharaoh's armies occupied and off balance. The pursuit of security through expansion is a treadmill, a process that generates the very insecurity it was designed to eliminate, because every expansion creates new frontiers that need defending, new populations that need controlling, new enemies that need deterring, and new costs that need financing. The Roman Empire discovered this on the Rhine and the Danube. The British Empire discovered it in India and Africa. The American superpower discovered it in Vietnam and the Middle East. Thutmose I discovered it on the Euphrates. 3,500 years ago, on the banks of a river that flowed in the direction his universe said was impossible. Thutmose's empire was more secure than the pre-Hyksos kingdom had been, but it was also more expensive, more complex, and more dependent on the continuous exertion of military force to maintain. It means, third, that the encounter with the unknown changes us, whether we acknowledge it or not. The Egyptians who marched to the Euphrates were not the same people when they returned as when they had set out. They had seen a world that their cosmology could not explain, cities that their gods had not built, peoples that their creation myths had not accounted for, a river that their universe did not contain. They incorporated these experiences into their existing framework rather than revising the framework itself, calling the Euphrates that inverted water, rather than questioning why their cosmology assumed all rivers flowed north. But the encounter left its mark nonetheless. In the foreign words that entered the Egyptian language, in the foreign deities that entered the Egyptian pantheon, in the foreign artistic motifs that appeared in Egyptian art, the Minoan-influenced spirals and marine motifs that decorated New Kingdom pottery, the Levantine-inspired jewelry designs that adorned the tombs of the Theban elite, the Syrian-derived architectural elements that appeared in the palaces and temples of the New Kingdom, and in the subtle, gradual, ultimately transformative expansion of the Egyptian imagination. The New Kingdom was a more cosmopolitan, more diverse, more culturally complex civilization than the Middle Kingdom had been, not because the New Kingdom pharaohs sought cosmopolitanism, but because the empire they had built made cosmopolitanism unavoidable. You cannot rule foreign peoples without learning something about them. You cannot extract their resources without engaging with their economies. You cannot maintain diplomatic relations with foreign kings without learning their languages, understanding their customs, and acknowledging, however grudgingly, that their civilizations have value. The empire that Thutmose built forced Egypt to engage with the world, and the engagement, however one-sided and however exploitative, changed Egypt as surely as it changed the peoples it conquered, that came from knowing that the world was larger, older, and more complex than any single civilization could comprehend. The ruins of Thutmose's empire are scattered across 2 continents. In Nubia, much of it now submerged beneath the waters of Lake Nasser, the fortress towns and temple complexes that administered the Egyptian province of Kush have been partially excavated, partially drowned, and partially lost. In the Levant, in modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, the evidence of Egyptian imperial presence survives in scattered inscriptions, in the archaeological remains of Egyptian-style buildings, and in the diplomatic correspondence of the Amarna period that records the complex web of relationships between the pharaoh and his vassal states. At Karnak, the temple complex that Thutmose I expanded with contributions that were later eclipsed by the more massive constructions of his successors, his name survives in inscriptions that his grandson, Thutmose III, would later claim to have surpassed. There is a poignancy in the archaeological record of the New Kingdom that is easy to miss if you are focused on the grand narrative of imperial expansion and military glory. Alongside the monumental temples and the richly decorated tombs and the triumphant campaign records, there are quieter artifacts, personal letters, medical texts, administrative records that reveal the human cost of the imperial project that Thutmose I initiated. Letters from soldiers serving on the Nubian frontier complain about the heat, the isolation, and the difficulty of obtaining basic supplies. Medical papyri describe the treatment of wounds sustained in battle, arrow injuries, sword cuts, chariot accidents, with a clinical precision that makes the violence of Bronze Age warfare viscerally real. Administrative records from the fortress towns show the bureaucratic machinery of empire in its daily operation, the requisition of grain, the assignment of labor, the management of foreign populations, the 1,000 tedious details that sustained the grand project of imperial governance. These documents remind us that the empire Thutmose built was not an abstraction. It was a human enterprise, sustained by the labor and the suffering of thousands of ordinary people, whose names are lost, but whose lives were shaped, constrained, and sometimes consumed by the imperial project that their pharaoh had set in motion. The Valley of the Kings, the necropolis that Thutmose may have inaugurated, is itself a monument to the changed consciousness of the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom pharaohs had built pyramids, massive, visible, ostentatious declarations of divine power that were designed to be seen from miles away. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs had continued the pyramid tradition in modified form, smaller, more practical, but still fundamentally public monuments that announced the pharaoh's presence and power to the world. The New Kingdom pharaohs abandoned the pyramid entirely, burying themselves in hidden rock-cut tombs in a remote valley on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The shift from pyramid to hidden tomb is a shift from confidence to caution, from a worldview that believed the pharaoh's divine power was self-protecting to a worldview that understood, through the bitter experience of the Hyksos and the centuries of tomb robbery that had preceded it, that nothing is truly safe. The tombs in the Valley of the Kings are magnificent, decorated with paintings and texts of extraordinary beauty and complexity. But they are hidden. They are not meant to be seen. They are meant to survive. And this shift, from display to concealment, from confidence to vigilance, from the assumption of permanence to the acceptance of vulnerability, is the cultural legacy of the Hyksos experience, made physical in the stone and sand of the Theban necropolis. But the most enduring legacy of Thutmose I is not any single monument or inscription. It is the idea of empire itself, the idea that Egypt's destiny lay beyond the Nile Valley, that the pharaoh's responsibility extended to the farthest reaches of the known world, that the safety of the Nile Valley depended on the control of distant territories that most Egyptians would never visit and could barely imagine, and that the maintenance of Ma'at required not just the performance of rituals and the administration of justice within Egypt, but the projection of divine authority across the entire earth. This idea, radical, transformative, and ultimately unsustainable, was Thutmose's gift to the civilization he served. It was the idea that made the new kingdom possible. It was the idea that drove Thutmose III to fight 17 campaigns in the Levant, that motivated Amenhotep III to maintain a diplomatic network spanning the entire Near East, that inspired Ramesses II to build monuments on a scale that still staggers the modern imagination. It was also the idea that ultimately proved unsustainable, because the maintenance of an empire requires resources that the imperial core cannot indefinitely provide, because the administration of distant territories creates problems that grow more complex with each passing generation, and because the cultural encounter with the conquered world changes the conqueror in ways that are impossible to predict and difficult to control. The idea of empire is like fire. It illuminates, it warms, it transforms, but it also consumes, and the fuel it consumes, in the end, is the civilization that lit it. The new kingdom burned for 5 centuries. 5 centuries of temples and tombs and campaigns and treaties, and the relentless, exhilarating, exhausting business of running an empire that stretched from Africa to Asia. 5 centuries of glory, 5 centuries of cost. And when the flame finally went out, when the sea peoples came and the trade routes collapsed and the administrative machinery could no longer sustain the weight of the commitments that 4 centuries of imperial policy had accumulated, what remained was the memory. The memory of Thutmose standing on the banks of the Euphrates, the memory of Thutmose III at Megiddo, the memory of Ramesses at Kadesh, the memory of an empire that had been, for 5 extraordinary centuries, the most powerful, the most ambitious, and the most culturally productive civilization on Earth. And it was the idea that would, in the end, exhaust the civilization that embraced it. It is late. The desert wind moves sand across the surface of the Theban necropolis, where the tombs of the New Kingdom pharaohs lie hidden in the valleys and hillsides of the West Bank. Somewhere in this landscape, perhaps in a tomb that has been identified, perhaps in one that remains undiscovered, the body of Thutmose I awaits whatever form of eternity the Egyptian priests prepared for him. His original burial may have been in the Valley of the Kings. He is believed to have been the first pharaoh buried in that iconic necropolis, the narrow, sun-baked valley that would eventually contain the tombs of more than 60 pharaohs, queens, and nobles of the New Kingdom, including the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, which Howard Carter would discover in 1922, more than 3,300 years after the Boy King was laid to rest. If Thutmose was indeed the first royal burial in the Valley of the Kings, then he was the inaugurator of one of the most extraordinary burial grounds in human history, a necropolis that combined the theological ambitions of Egyptian funerary religion with the practical lessons of a civilization that had learned, through centuries of bitter experience, that even the pharaoh's eternal rest could not be guaranteed, abandoning the pyramid tradition that had served Egyptian royalty for 1,000 years, in favor of a hidden rock-cut tomb that would, in theory, Protect the royal body from the tomb robbers who had plundered every pyramid since the Old Kingdom. The choice was pragmatic rather than theological, a decision driven by the hard-won knowledge that monumental tombs attracted thieves, and that the best way to protect the pharaoh's eternal rest was to hide it. His mummy has had a complicated afterlife. It may have been among the royal mummies recovered from the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881, a hiding place where the priests of the 21st Dynasty had gathered the royal dead to protect them from the robbers who had been systematically plundering the Valley of the Kings. A mummy identified as Thutmose I was found in a coffin that originally belonged to someone else, a detail that suggests the pharaoh's original burial had already been disturbed, and that the body had been rewrapped and relocated at least once before being placed in the cache. The coffin in which the mummy was found bore the name of Thutmose I, but it was clearly not the original coffin. It was a replacement, provided by the priests who had salvaged the royal dead, that was cruder and less elaborate than the coffin a pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty would have been buried in. The original burial goods, the gold, the jewels, the elaborately crafted funerary objects that would have accompanied the pharaoh into eternity, were gone, stripped away by the robbers who had violated the tomb centuries before the priests arrived to rescue what was left. What survived was a body, or a body that the priests believed to be Thutmose's, rewrapped in new linen, placed in a recycled coffin, and hidden in the cache alongside the mummies of other New Kingdom pharaohs in a desperate attempt to preserve for eternity what the living world had proven unable to protect. Recent DNA analysis and CT scanning have cast doubt on this identification, and the question of which mummy, if any, belongs to Thutmose I remains open. The soldier pharaoh who marched to the Euphrates and stood on the banks of a river that flowed the wrong way may be lying in a museum case under the wrong name, or in a tomb that has not yet been opened, or in fragments that have been scattered across collections on 3 continents, or in the sand of the Theban necropolis, undisturbed and undiscovered, waiting for the excavation that may never come. The uncertainty is itself a kind of commentary on the story we have been telling, a reminder that the man who opened the door to the known world has himself become, in death, a mystery that the known world has not yet solved. But the uncertainty about Thutmose's mortal remains should not obscure the certainty of his achievement. Whatever happened to his body, what he built with that body endures, not in stone or in gold, but in the strategic framework, the institutional innovations, and the expanded consciousness that his campaigns bequeathed to the civilization he served. The pharaoh's body is lost. The pharaoh's legacy is everywhere. The soldier pharaoh who marched to the Euphrates and stood on the banks of a river that flowed the wrong way may be lying in a museum case under the wrong name, or in a tomb that has not yet been opened, or in fragments that have been scattered across collections on 3 continents. We may never know. But the empire he built, or rather, the empire he began, endures in the archaeological record as one of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world. The new kingdom that Thutmose helped to create would produce the greatest and most sustained concentration of monumental architecture, artistic achievement, and military power in the history of the pre-classical world. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the colossal statues of Abu Simbel, the diplomatic correspondence of the Amarna period, the military campaigns of Thutmose III, who would refine his grandfather's strategic vision into the most sophisticated imperial system of the Bronze Age, the religious revolution of Akhenaten, the golden treasures of Tutankhamun, the death mask, the shrines, the sarcophagus, the thousands of objects that were packed into a tomb so small that they had to be stacked to the ceiling, all made possible by the wealth of an empire that stretched from Africa to Asia and that commanded resources beyond the imagination of any earlier Egyptian state. The monumental ambitions of Ramesses the Great, who would build more temples, erect more statues, carve more inscriptions, and father more children than any pharaoh in history, all of it funded by the imperial revenues and motivated by the imperial ideology that Thutmose had established. All of this flows from the moment when a soldier pharaoh led his army across the Sinai, through the Levant, past the cedar forests of Lebanon, and stood on the banks of a river that flowed in the direction that the Egyptian universe said was impossible. So here is the answer to the question we began with. What does it mean to look upon a river that flows the wrong way? It means that the world is not what you thought it was. It means that the order you have maintained, the order of the Nile, the order of Mat, the order of a civilization that has endured for 15 centuries, is not a universal truth, but a local achievement. It means that beyond the borders of everything you know, there are rivers you have never seen, flowing in directions you never imagined, through lands where the gods have different names and different faces and different demands, and the stars make different patterns, and the rules you have lived by do not apply. It means that the universe is larger than your map of it, and it means that the choice you face, the choice that every civilization faces when it encounters the vastness of the world beyond its borders, is whether to retreat into the comfort of familiar categories or to step forward into the unknown, carrying your identity with you like a fragile torch in the vast and howling dark, and accept that the world you are entering will change you as surely as you change it. Thutmose I stepped forward. He carried the torch of Egyptian civilization to the banks of the Euphrates and planted it firmly and deliberately in foreign soil. He showed Egypt that the world was larger than the Nile Valley, and that the pharaoh's authority, if it was to mean anything, had to extend beyond the borders of the familiar into the territories of the unknown. He did not resolve the contradiction between the Egyptian worldview and the reality of the wider world. No one could have done that in the 15th century BC, but he opened the door, and the civilization that walked through it became, for the next 4 centuries, the most powerful and most magnificent in the ancient world. The Euphrates still flows from north to south, as it has flowed since long before the first pharaoh placed the double crown upon his head. The Nile still flows from south to north. The two rivers still defy each other across 1,000 kilometers of desert and mountain and sea. And somewhere in the silence between them, in the space between the world as it is and the world as we imagine it to be, the story of a common soldier who became a pharaoh and a pharaoh who became the first emperor of an Africa superpower continues to echo, as it has echoed for 3,500 years. The world is always larger than we think it is, always stranger, always more complex. The river always flows in a direction we did not expect, and the only map that matters, the only map that has ever mattered, is the one we are willing to redraw.